I never expected to encounter what I did that night. In all my years of service, I had been prepared for nearly anything: sickness, grief, death, but what happened that evening shattered every expectation I'd held about the work I do. I often wonder why that particular case has stayed with me, clinging to the edges of my mind like a shadow. The memories aren't fading. The horror lingers, and every time I close my eyes, I can still see her. It was a cold Tuesday evening when Sister Maria, a newer nun who had only joined us a few months before, came to find me. The air outside had a bite to it, sharp enough to send a shiver down my spine. She was visibly distressed, hands trembling slightly as she handed me a small piece of paper with a name written on it. Isabella Morel. Please, Sister Catherine, could you go to room 9? They're asking for a nun, she said, her voice wavering. I hadn't heard of this patient before. The name didn't ring any bells, which was unusual in itself. Our hospital, nestled just outside the city, wasn't large, and I had seen most of the faces that came through. But there was something different about the way Sister Maria spoke in urgency, a sense of discomfort I couldn't place. Of course, I said, not yet aware of what I was about to walk into. The hallways were eerily quiet when I walked through the dimly lit corridor. There was no bustling of nurses, no faint murmur of patients in their rooms. The building seemed to be holding its breath. I could hear the faint hum of the ventilation system as I reached room 9. The door was cracked open, which struck me as odd. In all my years, I'd either never known a hospital room to be left like that without the occupant being heavily sedated or in a deep sleep. I knocked softly on the doorframe, but there was no answer. Hesitantly, I pushed it open, a chill creeping up my spine. The room was dark, with only a faint glow from the streetlight outside casting long shadows across the walls. There, in the far corner, was a woman. She was seated in a chair, her back to me, her head tilted slightly to the side, as though she were listening for something. Miss Morel, I called softly, my voice almost swallowed by the silence. She didn't turn, not at first. Her hair, dark and tangled, cascaded down her back like a veil, obscuring her face. I stepped closer, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as a sense of foreboding washed over me. I'm Sister Catherine. I'm here to offer you comfort and prayer, I continued, keeping my tone gentle. The woman's head tilted farther, and for a moment, I thought she was simply ignoring me. But then, slowly, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you hear them too? She asked, her voice hollow, as if she was speaking from a great distance. The words sent a shiver through me. Them, I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite the unease that had begun to knot in my stomach. The voices, she answered simply, still not facing me. They talk to me when the lights go out. I approached cautiously, but still, she didn't look at me. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white with tension. The room felt unbearably still, as if the air itself was too thick to breathe. Do you want to talk about it? I asked, lowering myself onto the edge of the bed. The silence stretched on longer than it should have before she finally turned her head, her gaze locking onto mine. Her eyes were vacant, unfocused. There was something deeply unsettling in them. It wasn't just sadness or fear, it was something darker, something ancient. Don't listen to them, sister, she said, her voice trembling now. They want to take me. They want to drag me into the dark. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest, as though something was pressing down on me, suffocating the air. But I pressed on, trying to stay calm for her sake. You're not alone here. We can pray together. God's love and light are stronger than anything that tries to take us, I said, though even as I said it, I felt the words ring hollow in the room. She shook her head, her dark hair swirling around her face. No, you don't understand. You don't understand what I've seen. She stood suddenly, her movements jerky and unnatural. She stepped toward the corner of the room, eyes fixated on something I couldn't see. I could feel a present, something unseen, but palpably there, just beyond the edge of perception. I see them in the dark, Isabella whispered again, her voice raw with fear. They're waiting for me. I followed her gaze, but there was nothing in the corner of the room, only shadows. Only the bare flicker of the streetlight casting distorted shapes across the walls. Isabella, please, I said, my voice more insistent now, though the dread building in my chest threatened to crack through. Tell me what's happening. I'm here to help you. She turned toward me, her expression wild, her lips trembling. They want my soul. They want to drag me into the depths of the darkness. I can feel them waiting just behind me. Her words were like a chill wind cutting through me. I tried to reach for her, but before I could move, she screamed. A blood-curdling shriek that rattled the walls and set my heart pounding in my chest. The room seemed to darken in an instant, the shadows in the corners seeming to stretch and twist unnaturally, as though they were reaching for her. I lunged forward, but before I could touch her, she vanished. She wasn't gone, exactly, but there was a shift and absence in the room, a sense of overwhelming emptiness. The room felt colder, the air heavier, as though something was missing, and I could no longer hear her breathing. The lights flickered, then went out completely. A voice, faint but unmistakable, echoed through the darkness. "Join us." I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins. The voice was not her voice, it was otherworldly, like a chorus of whispers, each one overlapping the other. They were surrounding me now, pressing in from all sides. They were everywhere. I could feel them, could almost taste their presence, and I knew with a gut-wrenching certainty that they were waiting for me too. A door slammed somewhere down the hall, followed by hurried footsteps. I stumbled backward, desperately reaching for the bedside lamp, my hands shaking as I tried to turn it on. But when the light flickered back to life, she was gone. Isabella was no longer in the room, but as I stood there, panting, my body trembling from head to toe, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there waiting for something, or someone. The voices were still whispering. I was the only one left in that room, but in the deepest corners of my soul, I knew I wasn't alone. The silence after her disappearance was suffocating. I stood there, my hands still on the bedside lamp, trying to steady my breathing. But the longer I stayed in the room, the more the oppressive feeling grew. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, thicker, like they were alive, pulsating with an energy I couldn't understand. My heart raced, but I forced myself to move, inching toward the door with the thought of getting help. I stepped into the hallway, expecting to find the usual quiet of the night shift, but instead, there was a strange stillness. No sounds of nurses or footsteps. The hospital, which was always alive with hushed murmurs, felt dead. I quickly made my way to the nurses' station. Sister Maria was there, her face as pale as the walls around us. Her hands were shaking as she flipped through a patient file, but she didn't notice me approaching. It wasn't until I stood right beside her that she looked up, her eyes wide with fear. "Sister Catherine," she whispered. "She's gone, isn't she?" My stomach twisted, my pulse quickening at the mention of Isabella's name. "Gone? What do you mean gone?" Sister Maria glanced around, lowering her voice even further. "I heard them too after you went in. The whispers, the screams." Her eyes darted to the empty hallway, as if expecting someone or something to appear. The others heard them as well, in the rooms, down the hall. But not like before. It's different now. I took a step back, my heart sinking. "I need to see her again," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "Sister, it's not safe," she replied, her voice almost pleading. "Please, I don't know what's happening, but something's wrong with room 9. It's not just Isabella, it's the entire ward." Her words sent a jolt of panic through me. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, glancing around once more before leaning closer. "The nurses are reporting things moving on their own, rooms shifting, shadows watching. They say it's as though the spirits are restless." And her voice broke off, and I saw the unmistakable fear in her eyes. I wasn't too sure if she meant the supernatural kind of spirits, or if something far more insidious was happening, something that went beyond the physical realm of sickness and death. But the unease in her voice told me that we were no longer dealing with the regular hauntings of the human soul. This was something else. "I need to go back to room 9, I said firmly, feeling a growing sense of dread. I didn't know what had happened to Isabella, but I couldn't leave her like this. Not after everything she'd said, everything she'd warned me about. I couldn't just walk away. Sister Maria's face crumpled in distress, but she didn't stop me. She knew I couldn't ignore this, not after what I'd seen. I walked back down the hallway, my footsteps echoing, breaking the unnerving stillness of the air. The cold seemed to follow me, wrapping itself around my limbs, making each step harder to take. When I reached the door to room 9, I paused, placing my hand on the doorknob. It was cold, too cold. I could feel the weight of the room behind the door, as though something dark was pressing against it. I turned the handle slowly, and the door creaked open. The room was darker than before. The blinds were drawn, but even with the weak light from the hall, I could sense the thick atmosphere of dread that had settled here. I stepped inside, my breath catching in my throat. The chair Isabella had been sitting in was empty, but I felt her presence in the room, even before I saw it. The air itself was charged, crackling like static, the kind you feel just before a storm. The room seemed alive in a way it shouldn't have been. Then, I saw it. In the corner, where Isabella had been staring before, the shadows shifted unnaturally. At first I thought it was just my eyes adjusting to the dim light, but no, The shadows moved, twisting like tendrils of smoke. They reached, stretching toward me. It felt as though they were alive, seeking something, someone. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt my legs give way beneath me, and I sank to the floor, gasping for air. I could hear the whispering again, soft at first, then growing louder, until it felt like the room was closing in on me. Come closer. The voice was unmistakably Isabella's voice, but it was warped, a hollow echo like something had taken her inside out. The voice seemed to crawl under my skin, burrowing deep into my thoughts. No, I whispered to myself, shaking my head. No, this isn't real. I tried to get up, but the shadows on the walls, the corners of the room, they were growing darker, thicker. They weren't just shadows anymore, they were something else, something otherworldly. And then I saw it, a figure shrouded in black, standing in the corner where Isabella had been, the shape of a person, but distorted, twisted. Its form flickered like a shadow under flickering light. It took a step toward me. The air thickened. My breath caught in my throat. I felt like I was suffocating, as though the very presence of this figure was sucking the life out of the room. It was wrong, all wrong. It wasn't just the appearance of death. It was the presence of something beyond it, something ancient and hungry. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. Join us, the whisper came again, this time louder, more urgent. It wasn't just a voice, it was a command. Before I could make sense of it, I felt the coldness in the room shift. The figure was closer now, its eyes empty, hollow, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that it was not Isabella. What had taken her, what had taken this entire room, was something far worse. I could feel its gaze on me, the weight of its attention pressing down like an iron shackle. Every part of me screamed to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, trapped in the grasp of whatever this thing was. Join us, the voice repeated, this time directly in my ear. It was the last thing I heard before the lights went out completely. The darkness swallowed me whole. The silence was deafening, more oppressive than the shadows themselves. I couldn't see my own hands in front of my face, couldn't even hear the frantic beating of my own heart. For a long moment, I felt like I was falling, plunging into some bottomless void, weightless, but not in a peaceful way. It was as if I had been completely untethered from the world I knew, from everything that grounded me. I stood there, disoriented, unable to move, but I could feel the presence that was still here, in the room, waiting. My breath came in shallow gasps, desperate and ragged, as I tried to gather the courage to reach for the bedside lamp. Was it still watching me? I finally found the lamp, my fingers grazing its cold surface. I twisted the knob, and the room flickered to life. The dim light barely enough to chase away the suffocating darkness, but it wasn't enough. I could still feel the presence pressing against me, like the weight of 1,000 eyes. It wasn't just in the shadows now, it was in the air, in the very room itself. I blinked, trying to shake the panic creeping up my spine. My head was spinning. I needed to get out, I needed to get help. But before I could take a step, I heard it again, a soft whisper. It came from behind me, low, almost tender. Sister, why don't you join us? I spun around, heart thundering in my chest, but the corner was empty. There was no figure, no dark silhouette, nothing but the oppressive weight of silence that seemed to fill the room like a living thing. The shadows, though, still seemed to swirl, restless. I couldn't bring myself to look away from them, my eyes drawn to their unnatural movement, the way they stretched and shrank, as if they were breathing. I shuddered. Isabella. My voice was barely above a whisper. It was the only name I could think of, even though I knew deep down that this was no longer her. This was something else, something far darker. I had to tell myself it was only a trick of the mind, a hallucination brought on by fear, but I knew deep down it was more than that. I turned toward the door, my fingers gripping the handle, but before I could make my escape, I heard the voice again, this time louder, clearer, like it was right beside me. You can't leave, you can't escape. The words reverberated inside my skull. I wanted to scream, to run, but the force behind the words, the sheer certainty, paralyzed me. I couldn't move. You're not alone. I whirled around, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, but again, there was no one there. The room was empty, but the whispering, it didn't stop. It was everywhere now, coming from all directions, filling the room like a living thing. You're one of us now. The walls felt like they were closing in. My mind raced for something to hold on to, anything that could explain the impossible situation I found myself in. And then I saw it, the chessboard. It sat neatly on the bedside table, exactly where it hadn't been moments before. I hadn't noticed it until now, but the pieces were arranged differently. They were no longer in their standard starting positions. The board was a puzzle, a clue. I stepped forward, my legs like lead, but I couldn't stop myself. The darkened pieces, scattered across the board, seemed to pulse with a strange, ominous rhythm. Something was off about the way the pieces were arranged. They didn't follow any known configuration. My eyes froze on one particular piece. The rook turned sideways, as though in motion. My pulse quickened, a cold chill crawled down my spine. I could almost hear the board creaking, as though it were alive. And then I understood. This wasn't just a game, this was him. The thing that had replaced Isabella was playing its game. I couldn't stop myself from touching the piece. My fingers, trembling, hovered over it as the shadows seemed to grow closer, gathering in the corners of my vision. A voice, colder now, slithered from the walls. You should have left when you had the chance, sister. Now, you're part of the game. There's no turning back. The board seemed to whisper with each piece I touched, and I realized, with a sickening jolt, that the game had already begun. The pieces weren't just pieces of wood, they were fragments of something. Souls, minds, people. The game was real. The dark whispers were their thoughts. They were trapped, forced to play until what? I felt a sudden surge of panic. My breath came in shallow bursts, and for the first time in my life, I realized I was trapped. Before I could pull away from the board, the pieces shifted, as though reacting to my touch. The rook slid forward, and I heard a soft click from somewhere in the room. The door slammed shut with such force that I nearly jumped out of my skin. My breath hitched. I was locked inside. I spun around, but the room was wrong. The walls were now stretching, curling in on themselves, as if they were melting. The ceiling above me seemed to sway, twisting and contorting. And the whispers, they weren't whispers anymore. They were voices. Thousands of voices, all speaking at once, crashing together into a cacophony of horror. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, breathing and sighing with the weight of the dead. I stumbled backward, my hands raised, my mind scrambling for prayer, for anything that would break this nightmare. But my words, even the prayers I knew by heart, fell flat. The room was beyond the reach of any light, any faith. And then, in the midst of the chaos, I heard Isabella's voice again, clear and sharp. Cutting through the madness, I told you. You were never meant to leave. The figure in the corner no longer. Isabella stood watching me, its form flickering in and out of existence, its eyes locked onto mine, glowing with an unnatural light. I could feel its gaze burning through me, the weight of its stare penetrating every part of my soul, and I knew that this was it. I had crossed the line. I had stayed too long, and now I was part of the game. The darkness was alive around me. My senses felt assaulted on every front. The whispers were no longer subtle. They were roaring now, all at once, dense hundreds, thousands of voices, each one sharp with torment, each one filled with the kind of fear and desperation that could only come from souls lost in agony. They were inside me, inside my thoughts. I could feel them pushing into my mind, scraping against my sanity. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. The walls were closing in, their twisted forms pressing against me, as if they too were part of the game, part of the terror that had taken root in this cursed room. It felt like I was being consumed. I was no longer a nun. I wasn't a servant of God in this place. I was nothing, just a pawn in whatever dark force had claimed this hospital, this room, this soul. I clutched at my chest, trying to steady my breath, but it was as if the air had turned to tar. It was suffocating, impossible. My vision blurred. My hands shook as I stumbled backward. The chessboard glowed in the low light, its pieces shifting on their own, almost in rhythm with the whispers that now seemed to pulse through the room. The pieces were moving. My eyes locked onto the dark rook again, and I felt something inside me snap. The sickening certainty that this was no accident, no coincidence. The game wasn't just a game. It was a trap. I was part of it now. With trembling fingers, I reached out again, this time taking the rook. It felt cold, colder than anything I had ever felt before, like it had been pulled straight from the depths of hell itself. I held it in my hand, and that's when I heard the voice again. This time, it wasn't a whisper, it was commanding. You will play, sister, I gasped, dropping the rook back onto the board. My entire body was trembling. The shadows seemed to surge forward, as though they were reaching for me, reaching to claim me as their own. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, but I couldn't move. There was a sudden pressure in the air, like the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes, watching me, waiting for me to make my move. My hands felt as though they were encased in ice, but I had no choice. I reached for the next piece, my fingers shaking violently as I picked up a knight. The moment I touched it, the room seemed to shift. The air froze, the whispers fell silent. A new voice, dark and deep, echoed in the room. Your move, sister. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty, flickering room. The walls stretched, a dizzying illusion, like something out of a nightmare, and the shadows had all coalesced into a single massive figure. The figure in the corner was moving toward me. It wasn't Isabella anymore, it was something worse, something that was never human to begin with. It was clothed in darkness, its face obscured by a veil of blackness, but its eyes, they gleamed, sharp and knowing, like it could see into me, like it could see my soul. I didn't speak. I couldn't. My breath was trapped in my chest, my body rooted to the spot. I could only watch as it stepped closer, its movements deliberate, as if savoring my fear, and then, it spoke. You are mine now. Its voice was not one, but many a chorus of echoes, each one layered over the other. The words vibrated in my bones. No, I whispered, but even as I said it, I could feel the truth of it. I was already lost. I had played the game. I had crossed the line. The figure's eyes flickered to the chessboard, its gaze sharp and unblinking. I followed its stare, seeing the pieces that now moved of their own accord, pieces that weren't supposed to be moving, pieces that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, when I wasn't paying attention. Each move on the board wasn't just a step in the game, it was a step closer to my end. I felt the weight of my own helplessness pressing down. I tried to reach for the crucifix around my neck, but it was gone. My habit felt too tight, like it was suffocating me. The air was too thick to breathe, and every inch of the room felt like it was crawling with something evil, something other. I wanted to pray. I wanted to cry out for God, but the words wouldn't come. The voices were drowning out everything else. And then I saw it. The final piece, the queen. The piece that had always been the most powerful on the board. The piece that could change everything, my salvation. But as my fingers reached for it, I froze. The moment I touched it, everything around me shifted. The walls no longer seemed solid. The room stretched and contorted, twisting into a spiral of darkness, a vortex that threatened to swallow me whole. The shadows were alive, crawling toward me, pulling at me, and I realized with a sickening clarity that the queen was no longer a piece of wood. It was alive. It had a voice, it had a will, and it was calling me. Join us. The voice came from everywhere, reverberating off the walls, the ceiling, the floor. It was in my mind, in my thoughts. It was pulling me closer, dragging me into the center of the game where there would be no escape. I couldn't stop myself. My hand moved as if it had a life of its own. I placed the queen down on the board, and at that moment, I heard something, a sound like chains rattling. The darkness seemed to close in tighter, but I knew, deep down, that it wasn't just the room that was changing. It was me. I was no longer just a participant. I was a player. Welcome, Sister Catherine. You belong to us now. I couldn't speak. I couldn't scream. But I knew, the queen, the game, the voices, they were all one. I had crossed a line I couldn't return from, and now, I was trapped in this room, trapped in this nightmare. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the figure's final words. You are ours now. I don't know how long I stood there, unmoving, as the world around me dissolved into shadow. Time didn't exist. Nothing made sense. The silence was deafening, but even that faded into a kind of disorienting hum. I tried to move, but my body didn't listen. The room stretched endlessly, the chessboard now looming impossibly large before me. It became the center of everything else faded away. The pieces, the queen, the rook, they were all alive now, but not in the way I had thought. They weren't just pieces on a game board, they were souls, trapped, twisted, and I was one of them. A voice, soft and malicious, rippled through the room again. You will play until the end. I felt the air press down on me, heavy, suffocating. There was nothing left but the whispers, the collective consciousness of the game. My heart thudded painfully in my chest. I felt them all, their voices echoing within me, clawing at my soul. You're ours now, Sister Catherine. The voice came again, but it wasn't just one voice anymore. It was a chorus of voices, all speaking in unison, their tones low and relentless. They spoke of things I couldn't even begin to comprehend, things beyond death, beyond reason. I blinked, trying to focus, but the room was spinning. The shadows that had once been distant seemed to move closer now, crawling toward me like a mass of ink. The dark figure was still in the corner, watching me, its eyes glowing brighter with each passing second. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, to escape, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. There was something in the air now. a presence, dark and ancient, that had been waiting for me. It was as though the room had become a living organism, breathing, shifting, feeding off my terror. Every breath I took felt heavier than the last. And then, in the very center of it all, I saw her again. Isabella, she was there, but not like she had been before. She was no longer the woman I had tried to save. Now she was part of it, part of this twisted, dark force that consumed everything in its path. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and empty. She stared at me, but there was no recognition, no remorse. There was only the void. You should have left when you had the chance. Her voice was hollow, distorted, as if it came from somewhere deep within the shadows, deep within the void that surrounded me. I wanted to answer, but the words didn't come. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even think clearly. The whispers, the voices, they drowned out everything. But one thing pierced through the haze, the realization that I was not meant to escape. I had been drawn here. I had walked into this room not as a healer, but as a victim, a part of something I couldn't control. And now, it was too late. The voices had claimed me, and I was theirs, just as Isabella had been before me. I could feel the cold creeping over me, seeping into my skin, my very soul. The darkness seemed to consume me, pulling me further into its endless spiral. The chessboard was now the center of it all, and I realized, with a sickening clarity, that this wasn't just a game. This was a test of will, of faith, of everything I had ever believed in, and I had failed. The darkness pressed down on me, tight and unyielding, as though it were pulling me into the very bowels of hell itself. My mind reeled, the pieces shifting on the board before my eyes. They weren't just pieces anymore, they were souls, lost and damned, waiting for someone else to take their place. I could feel the weight of it all now, the weight of those who had come before me, those who had been consumed by this room. The room that was no longer just a room, it was alive, a prison, a trap. A final, cold voice echoed in my mind. You'll move. I closed my eyes, but the voices were still there, still calling, still whispering. There was no escape. But then, as if the game itself had granted me one last glimpse of mercy, I felt something shift, just a flicker. I opened my eyes, and for a brief moment, the shadows seemed to recede. It was enough. The door was no longer closed. I had a moment, a single moment where I could act. The weight of the world crushed down on me, but I had to move. I had to move. With a final burst of will, I staggered toward the door, hands trembling, heart pounding. I reached for the handle, my fingers cold and slick with sweat. But as I grasped it, the whispers changed. They no longer spoke to me, they screamed. I opened the door, and I ran. The hallway was dark. The air felt thick, suffocating, but I ran anyway. My footsteps echoing in the silence, my mind reeling from what I had seen, what I had felt. The hospital seemed so still, but I knew something had changed. Something had been awakened. I couldn't look back. I couldn't let myself. I made it to the elevator, my hands shaking as I pressed the button. The doors opened, and I stepped inside. The familiar hum of the machine offering no comfort, but I knew I had barely escaped. And the voices were still there. As the elevator descended, I closed my eyes, trying to block them out, but they wouldn't stop. They would never stop. And as I stepped out into the cold night air, I realized with horror that the game had never truly ended. The voices would follow me. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Every comment adds a new shadow to our haunted corner of the internet. Share this if you know someone who enjoys a good scare. More spine-chilling stories are coming soon, and remember, the scariest stories are the ones that could happen to you. Thanks for watching if you dare.